please join me in welcoming Dr. Jelks and Kristin Dumais.
Well, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you, Randal, and I was thrilled to see this book finally come into the world. We've been talking about it for a long, long time. And when I started to read it, I realized just what an innovative book it is.
Oh, wow.
It's unlike any other that I've read. And can you just start by telling us how this book came about?
This book came about, first of all, reading an article in the New York Times about radical women. And they had short paragraphs, and the paragraph that struck me most was by Margot Jefferson, and it was on Ethel Waters. And she, in the paragraph, I actually just met Ms. Jefferson, and I said that blew me away. The paragraph said, Ethel Waters was a notorious lesbian. And my head went around on its axis, and I was like, what? And I think as I approached it, I mentioned, like, I got to go do an article on this. I got to go figure out what was the relationship between the Graham Crusade that Ethel Waters sang at the end of her life. And then I began to think about other people's lives that I saw, and religion at least was a part of it. And how did they handle it? And I think everybody writes about African Americans for external relationships, but what's about the inner self that motivates people? And that's what I wanted to get at. What was the inner life of people? What are they thinking about? When your inner life is, you don't think about yourself as in categories. You transcend those categories of, and what do people think? And Then I said, after giving a talk at Calvin, I was like, well, somebody in the audience said, well, you should put yourself in it. I'm like, well, okay, that's a good idea, actually. So I gave a couple lectures, both at Calvin and at Loyola Chicago, and then I decided that I intersect with this story as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, so you make the argument that the inner lives of Black Americans are, and I have it written down so I get this right, are just as important to explore as the histories of human rights protests and political activism.
Yeah.
And when you start looking at those inner lives, they don't fit into neat categories.
That's right.
Nothing is neat.
No,
here.
nothing is neat. I use the word heterodox for a lot of things because they're not neatly categorized, and people's lives are opaque, and I use that term as well. But I think that's a lot of different groups. I read a wonderful book called Hard Religion about the really poor Southerners, black and white, and opacity is part of the religious experience and so forth. So yeah, so people are really opaque. We don't know all that motivates them, and I wanted to lift that up. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you chose these 4 figures, and one of my questions is, are they more heterodox than the average African American, or do you think they're somehow representative, or just any figure that we look at, if we start to look more deeply, that they don't fit into neat categories?
I don't think any person fits in a neat category. I use them because they're public, and because I thought they had writings that, and Ethel Waters wrote 2 memoirs. They were ghostwritten, but they were really expressive of her feelings. All of these people had letters and public life and expressing themselves publicly, so it was easier to get at than if I did an ethnography and gone out and interviewed a lot of different people. I probably, and taking a long time to interview those people to get at what was inside of them. But they actually had letters, and there's a whole cache of letters at the Library of Congress of Ethel Waters between her and her secretary. And you really get the sense of her struggles and her struggles with life, from the mundane to weight fluctuation to other things. Eldridge Cleaver left me wanting to drink hard liquor. He's really far more complex than people give credit for. I went out to Berkeley and read earlier letters they had, but Texas A&M actually has a collection of his papers, and that were really quite revealing and so forth.
So was it easy to pick these four? Did they just kind of jump out, or were there others that almost made it in? Any that you kind of wish you had had?
Well,
space for?
I thought about this in the sense of one of the great American novelists is Toni Morrison, right? I mean, and her birth name is Chloe Wolford, and she converted to Catholicism, and she wanted to take on the name Anthony, and her friend said, well, Toni might be better. And then she got married, and her last name became Morrison. But people don't explore that aspect of her life in her writing. And I thought about this a lot, that people have journeys or journeys away from religion, journeys to religion, and so forth.
Yeah, as I was reading this book too, it occurred to me that, and I could be wrong in this impression, but this kind of intersects different fields, right? This is Black history, and it's American religious history.
Right.
Other histories in there too, other subfields that you engage with, but in particular, American religious history and Black history. Did you feel like you were moving back and forth between two rather distinct conversations? I mean, when you look at these four stories, it kind of makes me think, how could you talk about one without talking about the other? But how do you see kind of the state of the fields right now and the conversation?
Well, I primarily teach at a state university now, and I primarily teach in a secular department, right? And my students don't know enough about religion. So, like, you can't write about anything in American life you don't know about religion. And I'm always pulling out my hair, saying, you don't have to believe, but you do have to understand the terms under which people engage their lives, and religious terms of which a majority of Americans still define themselves. And so, it's also a critique of the field. Like, people don't always think of themselves as deterministic by social class. Fannie Lou Hamer said, when she got up to fight the civil rights, Jesus told me that I had to fight this. And all these young activists, well, Miss Hamer, what's Jesus got to do with it? And then they learn, well, Jesus told her to get up and be a civil rights fighter. That's a different world, and that's where they intersect. And people often forget that people's lives intersect in kind of ways. That you get up one morning and you say, I'm a sharecropper, I'm a poor woman, the worst of the categories, and Jesus told me to get up and do battle with the sheriff and about voting. What do you say? So she had a deep sense of a purpose out of that, and that all the other civil rights, young people, including Stokely Carmichael, who becomes Kwame Ture, they all come to respect that this is a genuine who she is. This is a genuine situation. So people have lives that are different. And it's like Muhammad Ali. I got so frustrated. Everybody talks about Ali for being Vietnam dissenter, for dissenting from the war, but he's really dissenting as a religious thing, and it troubles the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court does not want to say anything about the Nation of Islam because they don't know what to do with this religious group that has a cosmology that, in fact, would say they're the devil, right? But they really are dealing. He's really. This is genuine. I read an article in Sports Illustrated by Bill Russell at the time, they all met with Ali, and Russell says, if we all had like that kind of faith, we'd be all right. I mean, he recognizes that they are trying to say, Ali, you can go to the army, you can, they're kind of negotiating. Jim Brown is leading this. You can go to the army box and this will be all over. And he says, no, this is not right. And he's really standing on principle of his religious principle. He says, my God tells me I never did, these people didn't do anything to me. I don't belong there fighting. And they're like, and I really think it has to do with the conversion of then Lou Alcindor, who's in that meeting, to Sunni Islam and so forth. Yeah.
So you spent some time in the archives to write this book.
I did.
What was your most interesting or unexpected discovery in the archives?
A novel by Eldridge Cleaver that he wrote before he wrote Soul on Ice, about two men in love in prison.
Yes.
And that was like, oh, okay. and it had theological references and so forth. So that was one of them. I think the other one, since Ali was dyslexic, so he didn't write a lot. But Jonathan Eig, who has a new biography of Ali, was generous enough to share stuff with me, and he discovered a letter that Ali wrote about. It was very fragmented, but wrote about the nation and why he was joining and so forth. All of the exchanges between Mary Lou Williams and one of her priests, they were all quite moving. I mean, because they could reveal themselves to people, that they were public people that they wouldn't ordinarily, like to the press or anything like that. So. And of course, Ethel Waters between her and her secretary. Yeah.
So what was the hardest thing about this book for you?
The hardest thing about this book for me, writing this book, was thinking back to how I was as a young person. Because that's, thinking about my days in Ann Arbor, my confusion in Ann Arbor. You get older, you're like, why was I worried about that? But in my deep search, reading materials, thinking about my own faith struggles at that time. So because I first heard Mary Lou Williams, and I tell this in the book. I walk into a record store. My favorite record store then was called School Kids Records in Ann Arbor, and it was the hippest record store in the city. I know people don't buy albums. Some kids in Lawrence still buy vinyl, but not like they used to. And they would play jazz, and they were totally eclectic. It was jazz or punk, early punk, and they had this pianist on, and it was great groove going. I was like, who's the pianist? And this is this woman, Mary Lou Williams, and I had no clue who she was. And then I came back to her. So judging up memories about when I was a young person full of confusion and trying to think radically and even think Christianly at times, more so than I think now. But I was trying to think about all those things, and they brought back a lot of memories for me. So.
Yeah, I loved how you wove your own narrative into this story, and your own religious history doesn't fit into neat boxes either so much. Missouri-Sin and Lutheran is a very neat box, but you didn't stay there entirely.
Well, I tell people I grew up in the segregated world, and I know Christian Reformed people. I'm making a joke about y'all. You think your life is you're the only ones that grow up in a very small world. Well, I grew up a Black Lutheran, and there were 5 Black Lutheran churches in New Orleans, and every Black Lutheran looked like me. So much so that I thought Martin Luther King was the founder of our church. So my mother said to me, she said, no, this is Martin Luther. In my little, in the Missouri Synod, you get Luther's Smaller Catechism with your first reader. You know, see Dick run, 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 and you're nothing but a worm, right? You got both of those right next to each other. You got both next to each other, so you're learning, okay, see Dick run, and I'm a worm, okay. And so, but that we had fellowship, and it wasn't until, I think, 1966 that the Missouri Synod tried to start having cross fellowship. And I asked my mother, we had a kids' day or something, and I came back and said, Mom, where did all these white people come from? Because I didn't think they were Lutheran. I was a Lutheran. They weren't a Lutheran. And so and we all had schools. So we had schools that went to 8th grade. Next to your church, you had a school. And in fact, in my church, it was a school. So I thought everybody was a Lutheran. And then in my neighborhood, you're either Catholic or Baptist or Pentecostal. That was where the sort of more eclectic came in, or Jewish, because we had a synagogue around the corner from our. So growing up in New Orleans is completely, kind of heterodox. You know, Black Lutherans, Catholics, you name it. You know, we had it. Yeah.
Now, you spent a good chunk of your career at Calvin College.
Yes, 15 years.
Yeah, in the Calvin History Department. Yeah. And
wonderful years.
We talk a lot about kind of faith and scholarship at Calvin. You've had to write little reports on that in the past. How?
You read my reports. I don't think they like them so much.
We kept you for 15 years, so it could have been that bad. How do you think, I mean, clearly, when you bring your personal narrative into this story in the way that you do, I think we can see the connections, but, how essential was your own religious journey to writing this book? I mean, could this book have been written without that faith perspective of the author?
I don't, not in the way it was done. I thought that it was very important that I share. Everybody on campus knows I'm a Presbyterian clergy, and I also wanted to share with my other colleagues that religious people are not crazy. That's a tendency. That they look at only hyper evangelicals on campus protesting. Religious people aren't crazy. Lots of faculty people feel embarrassed about being religious. And I'm like, this is what you get. So I just wanted to express that in a way that I thought was constructive. And so forth. But I also really wanted to talk to African Americans in many ways because that there is a pluralism within our community. 35% of Muslims in the United States are Black Americans. We don't think about that. Homegrown. And how do we have dialogue with a person who's a Muslim or whoever? What drove me crazy at Calvin was talking about the Christian perspective. There are multiple ones. And how do you deal with you're sort of living in the middle of Corinth with a lot of different faiths and talking to people with respect and mostly love. That's what I was trying to get at as well.
So one final question before we open it up to the audience. Who do you most want to read this book, and what do you most want them to take away from it?
Just read it.
Everybody.
No, I actually, my audience was, when I wrote the book, I thought about African Americans. I really did, because first, because there is such a rich discussion that goes on every beauty shop, every barber shop, Every time I go get my hair cut here at the barbershop, so, Dr. Jelks, what do you think about this? You know, I mean, like, I'm the resident expert, I may say I don't think anything about it, but people have a rich dialogue. It was reading Jean Genovese. It's an old book called Roll, Jordan, Roll, the World of Slaves, right? And Jean is writing about all these slaves having theological discussions, right? But he doesn't take it up because he should have. They were actually arguing about being Methodist or Baptist. And that was real because, my grandparents were Baptists. My grandmother, who I was reared with, was born in 1906. She was baptized in the Mississippi River in 1918 by Reverend Sweet. I got it all down on paper, right? And that was very important for her. That was a sign. What does this Baptist stuff mean for her life? Now my mother broke away from that tradition, but those were meaningful things for her life. So meaningful, I got smacked on the side of the head when I said, well, Granny, when you got baptized, did the doves come out? And because she said she got baptized just like Jesus. I was like, well, it's like, okay. But I realized quickly on that my grandparents, those were meaningful, and those institutions had meaningful language for them, and the Methodists had meaningful language for other people. And we should take people's languages serious when people talk about the Holy Ghost, as they used to say, or the Holy Spirit, if you want to be. So I wanted to take those terms and those faith terms as respectfully as I would want others to take the terms that I might use. If I say providential, that in God's good providence, this occurred, then we should take those serious. And I thought I'm in a perfect bridge spot to write between the life of the academy and the life of ordinary people. I'm the only one in my department who's ever buried the dead. And I often tell them I really do have real life experience, and or married or baptized a baby. So and people's symbols you have to take very simple, and everything can't be class consciousness, and without that. And yes, religious people can be on all sides can be a little bit nuts. And vote against their interests at times, but they also are moved to do extraordinary things as well. So for all the things that I know about evangelicals, I always tell my cocktail liberals that my evangelical friends actually go out in the middle of the Ebola crisis and do nursing and working. And y'all just talking about it, so lay off. Both sides of that. Both sides of that.
All right, questions from the audience.
I have one I've always wondered. With your Baptist grandmother, and you grew up in a Lutheran school, how in the world did you end up in a Presbyterian clergy?
That's providence. I knew in college that the kind of Luther, had a devil's bargain. He was saved by the elite. I mean, else he would have, he'd have been just another monk that got burnt at the stake. And the peasants, of course, when they start reading the Bible, Luther says, "Oh, you got to hold up on this. Don't read the last parts of that. Don't read that Revelations and those apocalyptic literature, because they see the German peasants see this. The real beasts are the lords that saved Luther, and he has to come up with two kingdoms. The kingdom the ultimate kingdom, and then, well, this is the regular kingdom down here. And I was like, I can't buy that, right? Because I used to ask my pastor, he has a nice inscription on in my Bible, saying, as a 12-year-old, like, well, what do you think about the Black Panthers? Have you read that 10-point plan? And he's like, no. I was like, Pastor Mueller, he's good German. Pastor Mueller, you should read the 10-point plan. It's quite interesting. What do you think? How do you deal with this? And I never felt that the Lutheran Church had a coherent understanding of the world around it. And as I was thinking about what is Christian faith for me as an individual, that I couldn't reconcile myself, even though I missed the beauty, because grew up close to Catholic. I missed the beauty of the liturgy. I just couldn't deal with the kind of theological thing. So I was a wanderer. I didn't know what I was looking for. So I went to the University of Chicago Divinity School for interview, and it was like I was doing a PhD at 23, and that was way over my head. Their program, and I happened to be walking through Hyde Park. Saw this place, McCormick Seminary. This is the absolute truth. I walk in the doors, and I'm cheeky, so I said to the admissions officer, "Hey, you got something for me?" And he says, "Who are you?" I said, "Well, I'm just interested in seminary." He says, "Well, come back, and I had this year of exploration year, and it turned out to be wonderful for my life. My first year of seminary, I had this professor who took a deep interest in me, a guy named Bruce Rigdon, who wound up dragging me to Romania and Hungary when it was communist and learning about the Orthodox Church. And it's through those experiences that I felt like the Presbyterian Church was something. It was, and at that time, McCormick was a very global kind of place, and it allowed me to explore what was happening on the south side of Chicago, and also what was happening in the world. So that's providential.
Dr. Jelks, you referred, I think, to the inner lives of Black Americans.
Yes.
Is there any substantive way in which those lives differ from the inner lives of white Americans?
Oh, no, nobody's inner lives, everybody has the inner life. But what gets explored more, is the inner life of white people. White people get explored all the time. Their inner lives get explored. You got a whole bunch of books about them. I just wanted to write about Black folks, right? It's sort of like, it's the assumption, this is the assumption, when I used to drive me crazy in philosophy, human beings, and they're always talking about white guys when they were talking about human beings. Not even women, they were talking about white guys. And I'm like, well, Black people are human. So I put Black people on the cover of my book because I don't want to be signifying here, but I think it's important to recognize that all people have inner lives, and we should imagine that just like anybody else, Black people have inner lives. No inner life is different, I don't think, but I wanted the people I wanted to read the book to imagine different. What's that struggle? And what's your inner life when you have to deal with the forces of social oppression, right? Now that is every one of these people have to deal with. When they walk in a place, people looked at them differently. That's a different kind of burden. So how do you escape that burden of race is such a strong force in America that you have to escape it. I always like to tell this story. At Calvin, I love this story. I had to go to the bathroom just before class, and family was one of those Fridays, visiting days. Family came up to me and says, "Do you know where Dr. Jelks' class is?" I said, "Yeah, it's right over there and I'm sure he'll be there in a minute. Because they couldn't imagine me being that person, right? I go to the bathroom, I wash my hands, I come back, get my notes, and I go to class, and they're dumbfounded. Because how we imagine who's going to be in what space. If you thought about the boxing ring, yeah, well, black guy in the boxing ring. But if you thought about on the prayer mat, that might be different. Yeah. So that's why I do it.
Yeah, I've been listening to white supremacists, blacks, people, Pan-Africans are have problems dealing with white supremacists. And why people of European descent never worry about black supremacists? We don't talk about that, Why do we have fear? That's what I can't understand. Why would we fear white supremacists? Why is it a threat to people of dark-skinned people? Is it because you see Jesus as a white person, and Jesus is related to power? So what if he was black? Jesus was black. Will we be afraid of white supremacists then? Will we be concerned about white supremacists if Jesus was black? So we don't know what color Jesus is, but he's portrayed as white.
Oh, yeah, I mean, since...
This is the thing I don't understand.
Okay.
I have no problem with someone saying I'm a white supremacist. Because...
I do, but okay.
I don't fear that. Because if Jesus is white, he's the most powerful person in the world. He's white, you might believe that, okay? And I don't really know the DNA of Jesus' father anyway. We should check that out. So this is...
Skip Gates maybe will get on it. I've said Henry Louis Gates will get on it.
So there's some unanswerable questions
That-
there.
Yeah, let me answer it this way. Religion takes on manifests power. All religion, whether it's Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, all religion can manifest power, and it loses whether it's Constantine, the great Roman emperor, becoming Christian and taking on manifesting power. This is always the dilemma in faith. My Mennonite friends always remind me it's Constantine's problem and Christianity, but it's a problem all over, right? Religion can manifest faith, but it also can. People also take religion. All kinds of people take religion and use it differently. So my grandparents and my grandmother they used to say it this way: God don't like ugly, ain't too particular about pretty, and that everybody puts on their drawers the same way. So for her, being a Baptist was radically egalitarian. No person was better than any other person, because that's what God told her. That's opposite of white supremacy, black supremacy, or whatever. I mean, the Nation of Islam has a cosmology that says white people are the devil, right? Now, if you look at it through Elijah Muhammad and Clara Muhammad's eyes, being pushed out of Georgia, experiencing the lynchings of Georgia, they might be right at that moment. But there are other people who had different experiences. So my purpose is that religion always manifests as power. People want to use religion for power, to grab power, to be imperialist. Always the danger is to pull it back and pull it back from the brink that it is about the best of we can offer is about respect and love of one another, and not power. So whoever grabs religion uses it. I mean, we have Hinduism in India right now, right? I mean, it's manifest about power and keeping the state intact. So we have to be careful always with religious understandings.
So our time is coming to an end for this part of our conversation, but I'm going to throw one more question your way.
Sure.
Can we look forward to children's books on Muhammad Ali, Ethel Waters, Mary Lou Williams, and Eldridge Cleaver?
Not for me, but but because I'm trying to write a children's book, and that's the hardest genre. Ay. You know, and I'm trying to learn from writer friends, and man, that is a tough outing. So when you see children's books, admire those writers because those are tough. But I'm writing meditations about democracy right now, and I have a film that I thought was going to be a very simple idea. Don't ever think go in the film business. But the film on Langston Hughes has taken a life of its own, and it's really fascinating. Speaking of somebody of religion, there's a great book on Langston called Langston's Salvation, How Langston Saw Religion, by Wallace Best, who teaches at Princeton. And so religion is all everywhere. So thank you all for coming out, and thank you for this conversation.
Yeah, and thank you, Randall,
Yeah,
for a great book.